This lesson on William Shakespeare's play Macbeth will concentrate primarily on the first act in terms of a general development of the plot as well as on major thematic implications. The first scene of Shakespeare's Macbeth begins on a desert place with thunder and lightning. The different nature of the cosmos and the atmosphere emphasizes the influence of the macrocosmic world, which will go on to influence the world of the human beings in the next scene or the later scenes. Shakespeare, by opening the play on this arid heath where nothing grows, where nothing vegetative occurs, where human existence is not prevalent, makes clear that in this play there will be an interplay of a macrocosmic world, of an arid landscape, and a microcosmic world of human actions, and they will interact and intersect with one another to create conflict and finally also to create resolution. In this regard, I would also like to point out that whatever happens in the larger world of nature not only influences human action, but whatever happens in the human world is also reflected in the larger world of nature. For example, in this scene where the second witch is saying, when the hurly-burly is done, when the battle is lost and won, we get an indication that in the following scenes there will be references to battle which will both be won and lost, and at the same time there will be hurly-burly or confusion which will occur both to create anarchy or chaos and both for resolution. And this scene also concentrates with the introduction of a character named Macbeth. It's important to note that along with the reference to Macbeth, there is a reference to a number of animal images who are the accompanying beasts who are always found with the witches. They are specifically called the animal familiars of the witches, and they are named immediately after a human character is named. In this way, Shakespeare also makes clear that in a world of complete chaos and complete anarchy, the relationship between the human and the animal, the relationship between the violent and the non-violent, the relationship between the fair and the foul, and the relationship between a foggy air, a filthy air, and a clean air is not very vast and not very different. This scene also introduces one of the major paradoxes of the play, namely that a battle can be both lost and won, namely that a fair thing can be foul and a foul thing can be fair. In Shakespeare's time, when he was actually writing this play around 605, there was a plot which had taken place, namely the gunpowder plot, which was a plot to blow up the English Parliament by a rebel. And when the accused was brought to trial, he tried to escape from the accusation by equivocating, that is, by saying something and meaning something entirely different. Therefore, equivocation as an idea was very prevalent during the time when Shakespeare was writing this play, and equivocation was a method or a weapon with which a political rebel could come out of a political problem. Shakespeare introduces this theme at the heart of the play and makes it clear that nothing in this play, be it event, character, or idea, will mean one thing when it is said so. It will also mean something different at the same time. In Act 1, Scene 2, the scene and the location changes because we enter the human world, specifically a world of kings and a world of his of people serving him, and a world of kingship, which Shakespeare introduces with the figure of a bleeding sergeant and bloodiness and violence. When Duncan says that what bloody man is that he can report as seemeth by his plight of the revolt to the newest state, Shakespeare makes clear that the birth of any state, even if it is under the quote-unquote good rule of a benevolent king like Duncan, is always hailed through violence and revolt. Therefore, Shakespeare keeps it in his audiences as well as in his reader's mind that nothing of a rebellion by Macbeth or nothing of a further rebellion by Malcolm is something which will be new to the state of Scotland, because it was something which had happened before, and therefore it is something which should be expected hereafter. Next, Shakespeare goes on to describe the way in which Macbeth crushes the rebellion of the rebellious Thane, that is MacDonald, who was importantly considered worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him from the western isles of Kerns and Gallowglasses is supplied, and fortune on his damned quarrel smiling, showed like a rebel's whore. Shakespeare introduces therefore two ideas. One is that MacDonald was considered a worthy rebel. It's important to remember that just as King Duncan is considered a good and a worthy ruler, just as Macbeth is considered a brave and a worthy commander, similarly MacDonald is considered a brave and a worthy rebel. Therefore, in the political space of Scotland, rebellion is something which is given space, and therefore, any desire by the state to crush the rebellion is also given equal space. Therefore, even though Shakespeare hints or gives a slight indication that Macbeth is here serving the king, Shakespeare also keeps it partly in our mind that maybe Macbeth is doing something wrong in killing someone who is quote-unquote worthy. Next, there is also a close relationship between rebellion and prostitution, which he calls rebel's whore, which is to say that the relationship, that just like there is a relationship between rebellion and worthiness, there is also a relationship between rebellion and flippancy. Therefore, Shakespeare is here as an artist not clearly saying that rebellion is something which should be supported, nor is he saying that rebellion is something which should be outrightly crushed. He is not clearly saying that a king, even if tyrannical, should continue to rule, nor is he saying that a king, if apparently benevolent, is someone who doesn't have anything violent at the root of his construction of the state. Therefore, as an artist, Shakespeare's point of view here is to uphold a number of different points of view rather than to clearly establish something as singularly important and most significant. The next important idea in the scene is to understand the way in which the killing of the worthy Thane, who had a very flippant relationship with rebellion, is being killed. For example, Macbeth unseamed his body from the nape to the chaps, that is, from his head to his toe. His body was crushed open into, or his body was cut open into two parts. Shakespeare is here not only demonstrating the contemporary Elizabethan conception of a concern with the human body as well as with the and also with the organs of the human body, but also highlighting the fact that the way in which a brave commander works is at heart a very violent and almost a gruesome act. The reason for which I emphasize this gruesomeness and this gruesome aspect of violence is to highlight that Shakespeare had a number of predecessors or a number of great tragedians before him who had influenced his writing of this tragedy. Namely, there were the Greek tragedians, Sophocles, who had structured the tragic approach of a Shakespearean play. But there were also tragedy writers like Seneca, who influenced the way in which Shakespeare handled the theme of violence in his plays. In Senecan tragedies, the gruesomeness of the action was singularly highlighted on stage. In a Shakespearean tragedy, there are very few instances in which a violence is actually depicted on stage. It's important to note that in this scene, Shakespeare is not actually representing violence, but he is reporting violence, which is Shakespeare's intelligent way of communicating the gruesomeness of an action, but not overtly showing it to the people so that their senses wouldn't be assaulted, but they would get a sense of the reality of the situation. Next, Shakespeare also re-emphasizes in this scene the way in which there is a close relationship between very opposite things. For example, and this opposition and the closeness of the opposition is something which afflicts the natural world as well as the human world. In this scene, there's a reference to, so from that spring whence comfort seemed to come, discomfort swell. So just like there is a very close relationship between fair and foul, just like there is a very close relationship between winning and losing, the battles lost and won, there is also a very close relationship between comfort and discomfort. Next, there is the sergeant and who uses a number of religious images with reference to Macbeth. The one most important image is the image of Golgotha. To quote the lines, except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorize another Golgotha, I cannot tell. Golgotha is the site where Christ was murdered, and therefore it's associated in human imagination, deriving from the Bible, to a place where anything godly is gruesomely and murderously destroyed. The way in which the battle against the rebels of King Duncan is taking place is just like this battlefield is compared to a Golgotha, where anything godly is destroyed, which is Shakespeare's very small way of hinting that even though we may feel that Macbeth is here killing someone who had rebelled against his king and therefore he was acting as a very loyal subject, he was also doing something very ungodly. And therefore we can also almost compare and understand Macbeth here as the Antichrist figure, someone who will destroy anything religiously calming and consoling. I emphasize on this point now because there will be later scenes where Macbeth himself will kill his king and he will himself say that he cannot say amen or that he cannot conclude a prayer because he has destroyed everything religiously calming and religiously consoling in his self. Then there is a reference to the other subjects of King Duncan, namely Lennox and Ross, who report further the bravery of Macbeth as well as the cruelty of Macbeth. And here we must understand that both the bravery as well as the cruelty of this subject of King Duncan is hailed by the king. He's happy about it, and he even rewards it with naming Duncan the Thane of Cawdor, the new Thane of Cawdor, because he was already the Thane of Glamis. Duncan says, "No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. Go, pronounce his present death, and with his former title greet Macbeth." Here Shakespeare is introducing to us one of the most brilliant instances of dramatic irony, which is to say that Duncan here says something which he apparently means and through which he wishes to communicate, that he is giving Macbeth a great title as a mark of honor, but there is also an underlying meaning that this action of Duncan will lead to his own destruction, because when Duncan is giving the title of a deceiver, as he says, to a new subject, he expects almost unknowingly that this subject will similarly turn out to be another deceiver and another rebel, like the earlier Thane of Cawdor. Shakespeare here emphasizes that to a certain extent King Duncan's destruction was wrought by his own actions, and later on he will also emphasize this point in the life and the actions of Macbeth. For example, there will be a number of things which Macbeth will do which will lead to his own destruction, and therefore dramatic irony is not only an instance which begins here, it's a running theme of the play governing the tragic vision of the artist in Macbeth. And the scene ends with the final relationship between losing and winning, which was referred to in the first scene. In the next scene, Act 1, Scene 3, the location shifts again to the desert place and the heat or the arid landscape. And it's important to note that Shakespeare is alternating the location between the human world and the world which is beyond the human, namely the supernatural, because it is the interaction between these two worlds which will comprise the world of Macbeth. In this scene, we are introduced to the three witches, and it's important to note the way in which they speak, because their kind of poetry is very different from the poetry used, for example, by Macbeth, at times very different, but also uncannily towards the later section, in the later sections of the play, uncannily very similar. For example, the first witch says, "A sealer's wife had chestnuts in her lap, and munched and munched and munched. 'Give me,' quoth I. Aroint thee, witch," the rum-fed Ronian cries. "Her husband's to Aleppo gone, master o' the tiger, but in a sea I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, I'll do, I'll do." It's important that in the poetry which is being used here, there is a number of internal rhyming, that is rhyming of words within sentences, as well as end rhymes, that is rhyming of lines, which is to say that this internal rhyming and the end rhyming creates almost an encircled world, or an encircled world of vocabulary in which the vision and the speeches of the witches move, which is to say that their meaning begins at one point, moves to another, and then comes back to that same point, but of course with a difference. But to the person who is listening to it, the meaning has multiple layers. Therefore, the kind of words, or the way in which words are delivered by the witches, become very easily subject to an equivocation, as we will see in this very scene. I am just here saying that the very structure of the sentences and the words used by the witches make them the best subjects who utter things, or who utter words specifically, in an equivocating manner. The way in which the witches wind up their speech is also very important, because it helps us understand the meaning of resolution in the play. They say, "The weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus to go about, thrice to nine, and thrice to mine, and thrice again, to make up nine, is the charms wound up." The way in which number symbolism, the way in which different landscapes like sea and land, the way in which connectivity, that is hand in hand, and the way in which charm, or a kind of a magical power, is associated with resolution, comments a lot about the ways in which resolution is going to be achieved in this play. In this play, towards the end, there will be ways in which the land and the sea, there will be ways in which movement and fixity, there will be ways in which the natural and the supernatural will come very close together. Moving on, towards the latter part of the scene, we see the ways in which Macbeth and Banquo interact with the witches. And in this scene, it's important to understand that even though the witches themselves are the greatest and the most powerful subjects of equivocation, they do not have a similar kind of influence on two characters, namely Macbeth and Banquo, which is Shakespeare's way of making very clear that if there is a moral strong point in a character, the equivocating power does not have its desired or a kind of a negative influence, which is therefore also Shakespeare's way of saying that if the witches have influenced Macbeth, it is because he was already open to that influence, or there was already an underlying temptation in him which wanted to be influenced, unlike Banquo. Before that, it's important to understand the way in which Banquo describes the witches, because that's a very neutral description of these other world creatures that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it. Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, but by each at once her chappy finger laying upon her skinny lips, you should be women, and yet your beard forbids me to interpret that you are so. Just like there is a very close relationship between fair and foul, between lost and won, and between comfort and discomfort, there is also a very close relationship between a male and a female being, between lips and beards, and between question and answers, which is to say that the world of the supernatural is not something which has a clear-cut meaning. The world of the supernatural is something beyond human understanding, and therefore it's not about a different kind of understanding at all. It's about a process of being or existence where the very conception of understanding itself is questioned, and therefore these number of questions which Banquo uses while describing the witches. Description is not about a clear-cut statement of facts. Description is about asking a number of questions which may not always be answered. It's important to note the way in which Macbeth deals or interacts with the witches. They hail him as Thane of Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, and then King hereafter. And Banquo describes, again a very neutral description, that Macbeth is completely startled and Macbeth is completely surprised by the way in which these ideas greet him, or the way in which the witches greet him. And he says about Macbeth, "My noble partner, you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems wrapped withal. To me you speak not, if you can look into the seeds of time." And then he asks the witches about his condition. But the point is that that he seems wrapped withal. He's completely consumed by what the witches say. He doesn't even have the consciousness to question the witches, that whether it's true, whether it's false. He's completely consumed by it, which is to say that Macbeth's openness to this kind of a proposition is surprising, because it was already there in his mind in some subconscious corner. Therefore, it really doesn't come out of his mouth in the form of a clear-cut sentence or a clear-cut question. Banquo, on the other hand, is someone who is genuinely curious and therefore asks very clearly that he's not biased towards them, and he would genuinely like to know about the future. And of course the witches respond in their very known equivocating manner, that he would both be lesser than Macbeth and greater, and not so happy yet much happier. Which is to say that Macbeth won't be happy because he himself won't be king, but of course he'll be happier than Macbeth because most of his successors will be kings. The point that I'm making here is it's not that equivocation is something which is disabling and disadvantageous. Equivocation is something which Shakespeare says is in the order of the world in which he was living. It's very important to remember that this play is being staged before King James I of England, or alternatively King James VI of Scotland, both being the same person. That a person can be both happy and not happy at the same time because of a single action. Doubleness, dual-endedness is something which is part of the existence of the human world, and therefore it's something which a human being should accept as a way, as almost a normative way, as almost a normal way of existence. It's just that people or human beings with a limited vision understand only those aspects, or give importance or emphasis to only those aspects of an equivocating statement which suit their desires and which match with their understanding. Shakespeare is saying that understanding is much vaster than what the human mind can fathom, and therefore understanding or knowledge is something which is a part of both the natural world, the supernatural world, and most importantly, located in an interaction between the natural and the supernatural. Finally, the way in which Macbeth responds, "The still you imperfect speakers, tell me more. By Cineas' death I am no one Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief. And speak, I charge you." Just a small indication that knowledge is not something which can be had with a tyrannical order or a dictatorial command. It's something which is gained through an experience of life and an experience of extreme suffering, which Macbeth gains by the end of the play. But now, without knowledge, he can command it, but towards the end of by the end of the play, he will have suffered knowledge and therefore will have gained most of it. The way in which he interacts with Banquo is also to make clear to the audience as well as the readers that from the point the witches implant the seeds of a great future, or a future of great reward for Macbeth. It is from that very point that his sense of insecurity begins. Your children shall be kings. Banquo, you shall be king. Shakespeare is making clear that this insecurity begins from the time we gain power, and it is this insecurity which will finally result in Macbeth murdering Banquo and desiring to also murder Banquo's son, even though they had not really rebelled against the newly installed kingship of Macbeth, because Shakespeare wishes to make clear that whenever a human being does not have power, he's not associated with it, and therefore he's not quite conscious about it, and therefore not overprotective about it. But with the gaining of power comes not responsibility, but a great amount of insecurity, and it is this insecurity of Macbeth which finally results in his downfall. The latter part of the scene is about how the words of the witches come very true. That is, Macbeth is actually named the Thane of Cawdor, and both Macbeth and Banquo are extremely surprised that the words of the witches come true. But it's important to note the aside of Macbeth. Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest is behind. Macbeth, from the point that he gets one of his desires fulfilled, that he becomes a Thane of Cawdor, is immediately hankering after the next, and therefore Shakespeare makes clear that with power comes not responsibility but insecurity, but also a greater temptation.